of my relationship with Michael, who I've already introduced as a former boyfriend, sorry. And still, no. You don't want to share that part. When I met Michael, this is not, well, when I met Michael, he had hair down to here. He wore a black leather vest with no shirt, and played a wicked, very wicked lead guitar. If any of you know the band Yes was just coming out then. Sounds like John Anderson, very good musician. So he's changed just a little bit.
Hard to believe.
Only on the outside. Only on the outside. Inside, you're pretty much the same. Evolved.
Perhaps.
Evolved.
I've been well coached.
Yeah, remember that? No. Okay, do we have everyone's in here? Okay, we are officially begun. Michael actually needs very little introduction. He is just an incredible person that, again, I've known since I was 18. He has worked in pretty much every industry, has worked with major CEO giants, and he's just going to share with us what he has learned. And then we'll have kind of an extended question and answer. So warm welcome to Michael Cusamano, Distinguished Professor at MIT, and 1,000 other things.
Hey, great. Thank you, Carol. Okay, well, I did think this was a good opportunity to force me to make some progress on this new book, and there certainly are parts of it I think could be useful for a group that is interested in coaching executives or CEOs. As I think you have some of my background, but originally I was interested in automobile production management and very quickly got interested in software development, software engineering. This goes back to the mid-1980s. And so I found myself working with senior executives of very large firms, as well as entrepreneurs of startup companies, and some of those became very large. Software was a hot space in the mid-1980s and continues to be pretty hot today, although it's morphed into many different areas, including internet services. One of the books I did was in 1998 called Competing on Internet Time, Lessons from Netscape and the Battle with Microsoft. And my co-author for that book was David Yaffe, a professor at Harvard Business School. David has written many cases on Apple as well as Intel. He's the longest-serving outside director on the Intel board from 1988, stemming from a case he wrote on Intel for Harvard Business School. And I've known David since I was a postdoc at Harvard Business School in 1984-86. So we've been collaborating and colleagues and friends for a long time. I myself have focused mostly on Microsoft, but have also wrote a book largely about Intel called Platform Leadership. The book on Microsoft was Microsoft Secrets. I think you know that background. So we've tried to actually look back and figure out what can we learn, what have we learned about strategy from these three great CEOs. And that's where the book came from. David came up with the idea for the book, and the current subtitle is Lessons in Leadership, Strategy, and Vision. And really for the next generation of CEOs. We really want to look back, but then help current CEOs to look forward. And we think of all these three guys as masters of strategy. And by the way, they're not easy people to coach. And I will talk a little bit about that. And I guess my experience with successful CEOs is that they have a lot of these same characteristics. They may not, well, I would say very few people are as successful as these three guys. But a lot of CEOs have the same characteristics. Just some background, too, to the way we think about this. You've often heard the adage that it's better to be lucky than good, and nothing is better than being lucky and good. And certainly in strategy, there are many things we cannot control, or in life itself, right? And actually, perceptive, successful people understand that they're where they are because of chance events, I tend to think when luck has a role, in my case, it's usually bad luck rather than good luck, but I think preparation, being able to seize opportunities, innate capabilities, or strategically developed capabilities as part of preparation are important. But timing is also important, and some things you can control, but other things you cannot. But certainly you can improve your judgment for making timing. So all of that is part of strategy and part of success. And so certainly Gates, Grove, and Jobs were lucky, but they were also very, very good and prepared when the opportunities arose for them. And there's other people like John Corzine is my favorite person who's neither lucky and neither good. And somehow or other he managed to become CEO of Goldman Sachs, a senator from New Jersey, as well as governor from New Jersey. But he's a person who took enormous risks in his business and professional life, and the odds finally caught up with him. But that's another story. Anyway, there is this spectrum, and we try to, again, teach people to do what they can do to offset or try to make their own luck. And by the way, the kind of coaching that I've done has been more around strategy and process and team building, not the kind of coaching that you, I think, do professionally, although I've often found myself needing some of those skills and talking certainly to CEOs about their lack of communication skills or their lack of leadership skills. So there's many points of intersection. So how to become a master of strategy? Again, our idea is that we can learn from these three guys. And these are three guys that David and I know very well and have studied very closely for 25 years or so. And it's mostly the period from the mid-'70s through around 2000, except for Steve Jobs, that really had a dramatic impact on business until just a few years ago. Really, these three guys have redefined how we think about business, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but also modern life and culture and how we use technology in our everyday lives and businesses. And, of course, three of the most valuable companies ever created. So we hope there are lessons for every aspiring manager, and hopefully for people like yourselves who are working with aspiring managers and want to help them be more effective. Very different people. Which is another part of understanding the mind of a CEO or an executive. Where are they coming from? I came from humble beginnings, as Carol has alluded to, but people come from all walks of life. Jobs we call sort of an orphan, flower child, college dropout in his first year. Not the kind of qualities we want to encourage our students to think about, but very much Jobs' personality and his remarkable insights and the way he used intuition came from that sort of counterculture background that he absorbed really in the late 60s and 1970s. Gates, the son of a lawyer, a very privileged family, tremendous expertise in computers going back to high school, also a dropout of this institution we're at right now, Harvard. But made the cover of Time magazine. And Andy Grove as well, Holocaust survivor, scientist with a PhD from Berkeley, not in semiconductor materials, but actually in a related field of chemical engineering. Also named Man of the Year by Time magazine at some point. A lot of common traits. Ambition was one of them, outsized ambitions. All three of these folks, but especially Gates and Jobs, really set out to conquer the world, to change the world, and they use words like change the world. So you have to deal with these kind of folks. Again, it's an outsized personality, and that's important. And the ambitions were not just for themselves, but really for their companies. Ferocious work ethic, again, and they set the standard for their companies. And I think, and that's part of what we realized, that they understood that, and that was part of their leadership skills, setting that example which they wanted everyone to follow. They valued and provoked intense debate, which is an unusual skill. I find a lot of CEOs that are not so confident in themselves. They don't really surround themselves with people who challenge them. And if you're a consultant and you challenge them, you're likely to get fired as well. By the way, I was fired from 2 board of directors last year because I did challenge the CEO. And I found in small private companies, if they don't like the advice they're getting, they can just remove the board members. So I think I need some coaching on how to coach. So we learned some of those things. I remember saying to a CEO who kept driving the company near bankruptcy, making loans, and then extracting more equity from the company every time he made those loans. And I finally got tired of it. I wouldn't sign another one of those documents, loan agreements and equity payouts. And I finally said, I'm sorry, Joseph, but you're rewarding yourself for your incompetence by taking more equity from all the employees, from myself, and you shouldn't do it. Do a loan, charge interest, whatever you want, but don't take any more equity from the employees. He fired me. But anyway, he's not a good CEO. He's incompetent, actually. But a really good CEO will provoke debate, will understand that there are different points of view. But I think you do have to learn how to talk to these folks. The great intimidators, but also great motivators. Nothing makes an engineer happier than getting a pat on the back from someone like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Andy Grove. But they can also, again, be a very powerful presence that require you to have a strong personality to actually work with them, or a lot of confidence in yourself. And same thing for employees. Also paranoid. Andy Grove wrote a book, Only the Paranoid Survive, for example, 1997. Bill Gates worried every day that some little startup company would do to him what he did to IBM. And companies did do it to him. He was right. Andy Grove felt the same way about unforeseeable events, like suddenly the internet appearing, or the personal computer, if you're a mainframe company, or some new technology. Steve Jobs was a little different. I don't actually get the sense that Steve was so paranoid in that way, but he was always sort of fighting an uphill battle. And we go into that a lot in the book. We don't have a lot of time to talk about that today, but there's a lot of things he didn't understand about the dynamics of these kinds of markets, which is why he drove his company into bankruptcy several times and was essentially a failure until the early 2000s, despite the great products and great brand that Apple created. But he learned, which is another interesting feature of Jobs. As a matter of fact, probably more so than Gates or Grove, perhaps. Jobs really learned to think differently and to change his behavior, to go against some of his instincts over time. And that's another chapter. Just some pictures of their backgrounds. They really started out just as fairly humble entrepreneurs, working with their friends, people they liked, very talented people. And of course, decades later, they became 3 of the most powerful and wealthy entrepreneurs turned businessmen in history, really. So, and this is the most important slide. We think, looking back retrospectively from our understanding of these guys, that if we had to describe, and we do have to describe, how they thought and acted, we think they followed 5 principles or sets of ideas or themes or developed skills that sort of follow this framework here. And I'm not going to talk about them all in any real detail, but one was, we call this idea, they developed the ability to sort of look forward and reason backward. And it sort of starts with a vision of where they thought the future was going, but also executing to make that vision happen, and doing a lot of things to build companies that actually made this vision of the future happen. We don't think we can teach people how to be visionaries, but we can teach them how to execute. Other things that we can teach are more about the mechanics of strategy and tactics. And in this case, we know that these guys thought very much like chess masters or game theorists, where they would take positions but try to think 2 or 3 steps ahead of what they thought the competition might also do. But have a goal and figure out how to reach that goal and be prepared to respond in different ways depending on what the competition did. Okay, so this is some of the kind of stuff we teach in an MBA course on strategy, or in a more advanced course than just the basic. Second was we think they learned how to make big bets, but without betting the company, really. Without risking what I call the mothership. Without making decisions that if they went wrong, they would go bankrupt. So we know in business, probably in life, certainly in investing, no risk, no reward. Little risk, little reward. So you do need to make big bets, but you need to do it in a measured way. So unlike John Corzine, these guys were not reckless. They never put the risk of the company at stake, which is, again, an interesting way to think about strategy and positioning. The third point is pretty specific to their industries, and I've written other books on this. And they thought not just in terms of building great products, but they tried to build what we'll call platforms, as well as complements to those platforms and ecosystems around those platforms. So this is a particular feature of high-tech strategy. I can talk a little bit about it. I don't think that's probably your focus, but for many, many industries today, this is a critical element of how we teach strategy, because you can't just simply design a product, throw it out to the market, and hope to be successful. That's what Steve Jobs used to do. But there's this thing called network effects around products. So you really have to understand the dynamics. And a lot of this is about building partnerships. And to some extent, learning how to make some compromises, but work with others to actually make your product the foundation of other companies' products. And that's really what a platform is. The fourth idea is really also about tactics and execution. I'm calling this, and David and I disagree on how to title this chapter, but I think they learned how to exploit leverage and to find that when they could find it, but also exploit power when they had that in different cases, in different circumstances. So depending on what the situation dictates. And we've developed some concepts around this, which we call judo strategy versus sumo strategy. David actually has another book, which was a spin-off of our Competing on Internet Time book, which is called Judo Strategy. And my spin-off was more about sumo strategy, which I called platform leadership. But that's another, again, another talk. And then the fifth set of ideas, which is where I was hoping to focus mostly today, is around execution. And our idea here is that they found a way to execute around what I'll call an organizational anchor. And this was really based on their personal strengths, but it set a foundation for how they thought about strategy, delegation of responsibilities to others, teaching others what they believed and knew to be important, as well as what they tried to structure within the company of what was unstructured, essentially, when they started. And part of that structure was actually leaving an institution behind that could, to some extent, outlive them. Okay? So this is how we're structuring the book. It's in 5 chapters. We have an introduction and a conclusion, which we are still writing. But is everyone with me so far? Does this make sense? And again, this is not a scientific study of high-tech CEOs. It's our experience with 3 fellows, but with a lot of other experiences around that to gauge what we think and to help us formulate these ideas. So in many ways, these are kinds of best practices. So high-tech industries are a little bit special. The degree of speed, innovation, early mover advantage, the notion of platforms, network effects. The value of a platform can grow exponentially as more users and complementers adopt it. We're familiar with things like direct network effects. One telephone is not very useful. Two is more useful. If everyone has a telephone, that's actually a network of communications, and then the whole telephone system, the value of the telephone network increases exponentially as more people adopt it. Facebook friends. But we have this thing called indirect network effects, which is based not only on users, but the number of complementers or other parties to a platform that are trying to take advantage of it. It's not critical to explain this in any detail, but just to reflect that these kinds of markets are very complicated, and the dynamics is such that companies can go from 0 to 1 billion customers in just a few years. That happened to Facebook. But they can collapse almost as quickly, which just happened to BlackBerry, for example, right, if you're reading the news. So this is part of the paranoia, I think, in the minds of these CEOs, because they're working in such explosive and dynamic markets. And so being able to think a little bit ahead can mean all the difference between success and failure, and making billions of dollars or losing billions of dollars. So just a quick example, which I drew up. I use this in my class. Facebook is a platform. Users can use this. A platform is something that brings people together for some common purpose, whether it's to get on a train or to use a device. You can make a product like the iPhone, or you can make it a platform when you open up the features in it to other companies. The application I use most out of this thing is a flashlight. And I know Steve Jobs wasn't thinking of turning this device into a flashlight, but he designed it in a way that other companies could access the flash for the camera and say, turn it on, and you have a flashlight. That makes it a platform for other companies to come and build their own products or services around it. So, the more users that use Facebook, the more valuable it is, and users, friends bring in their friends and friends of friends and friends and friends of friends, and you can understand how it grows. But the real value comes from another side of the platform when advertisers want to reach those users through the platform. But then there's other sides. There's complements or future applications or games, different services also, again, reaching users through the platform. And then partners, for example. So these are special markets, and I have a whole chapter just on the platform thinking and how those guys thought about it and evolved from just making products to making platforms and building the kinds of partnerships that were required to succeed in those markets. This is sort of a dumb question. Strategy, execution, what's more important? Obviously, they're really two sides of the same coin. We normally teach that it makes no sense to think about strategy without thinking about how you're going to execute. And there you have to understand the dynamics of your market and the competition, where your technology is going. Personally, I would find it hard to coach a CEO without having some context about the problems they face, but I think you can think more in terms of categories, what kinds of problems they face, or what kinds of markets are they in. Are they moving quickly or slowly, and do they have time to reflect, or how much time do they have? This was one of Grove's comments, if you're wrong, you'll die, but most companies don't die because they're wrong. Most die because they don't commit themselves. They fritter away their valuable resources while attempting to make a decision. The greatest danger is in standing still. And again, this is more or less true depending on the kind of market you're in. And again, I think that context is important. If you're in the toothpick market, that hasn't changed in a couple thousand years, I think, right? But the smartphone market changes pretty fast, right? So, Chapter 5, which I finished the first draft of this about 11 p.m. last night, and made up these slides today, last night and this morning. So some things are rough. There may be some typos. But this is how I'm thinking it. So the idea of this chapter, again, was to really highlight the execution issues. Chapter 4 about judo, sumo, was more about tactics, but it's very hard to separate great strategy from great execution. So on the organizational side, I thought, again, thinking back over these three guys and their companies, there were, again, four elements that were really important. One, each of these CEOs was able to find an organizational anchor around which to ground themselves and their companies. And I've done a search. No one else has used the term organizational anchor. It has some resemblance to other concepts some other people have used. But it's a new term. The second was...
Can you describe what it means?
Yeah, I will. I'm just going to go through the big picture, and then I'm going to dive more deeply. The second was this notion that they were able to pay extraordinary attention to detail, which was actually a way of imposing discipline on their companies and also teaching people what was important and what was not important and why. Because they also had the ability to keep hold of what was the big picture, what was the big goal. And I'll give you some examples of the big goals. Third is really about delegation. They were able to cultivate remarkably talented people that they could trust, and we call this a brain trust. Even in Microsoft Secrets back in 1995, I wrote about the Microsoft Brain Trust. And obviously, no one individual can run a big company by himself or herself. But cultivating that group of people, figuring out what to let go of and what not to, is a critical skill. And that's actually something that can be learned and taught and coached. And many CEOs have a great deal of trouble with that. And actually, Gates and Jobs in particular had tremendous difficulty with this, but came at it in different ways. And the fourth point, and I'm still struggling with this, although I knew all along that I wanted to, that another element of what they did was to create some structure around some of the chaos in their companies, but those structures reflected some of the key elements of how they thought and behaved and wanted to lead. So I'm calling this, at least for the moment, structure the unstructured, the key strategic process and leadership values, sort of institutionalizing them as much as possible, and using, again, that as a basis for execution. Okay, so to dive down a little bit. Okay. So I'm not diving down, I'm diving up. This was a cartoon that floated around on the internet, and just recently, I don't know if anyone has seen it. Anyone seen this? So I actually was struck by it, and because it's not an accurate organizational chart, but it really reflects a lot of truths about these companies. And we often know that companies tend to take on the personalities of their founders or their key leaders, for better or worse. And what struck me most was the Microsoft cartoon, which, and this is again part of the legacy of Bill Gates, creating a powerful division around Windows and then also Office, with Windows at the center of the platform, and all the other groups, which are really only three or four major divisions struggling with each other. Over time, once Gates left, the company devolved really into not chaos, but sort of war amongst these major fiefdoms of Windows and Office and then sort of all the other stuff. And they were not at war when Gates was there and in control, but things changed when he stepped down in 2000. They actually changed a couple years earlier when he got involved in the antitrust trial, and essentially was, from his point of view, sued for being successful. And he was so wrapped up in many ways disappointed and depressed from that experience that he started stepping away around 97, 98. And that's where that's the beginning of Microsoft's slippery slope into sort of second place. And this is part of his legacy. And it's just interesting, the other structures that Amazon, very symmetrical way of sort of structuring themselves and approaching new markets, very well organized with some guy at the top. Google, a little bit chaotic. There's a triumvirate at the top. Lots of networks, lots of ease of communication, but no one, a few guys in control, but some chaos. Facebook, lots of groups that seem to have equal authority across the firm, an open network. And then here's Apple, the other one that struck me, with a big red dot in the center, which historically has been Steve Jobs, and everything emanates from him, right? So centralized control, very functionally organized, really around a common theme and a common person. The challenge, again, for Apple is what to do now that Steve Jobs is no longer with us. And they've been struggling with that. Key people have left. The very nicely structured company has started to fray a bit. Okay, and then Oracle with its own issues. So I do a little discussion of this, but the organizational anchor. So let me get back to that. I think I read this phrase from Socrates many years ago, or know thyself. And I think this is very important as part of the organizational anchor. Know what you know and know what you don't know, and begin there. Focus on where the value is going to be, not where it is or where it has been. I think all these guys were able to do that. And again, this is part of understanding the dynamics of their industry and having a vision or a goal of where they want to go, but also the ability to sort of move themselves, their firms, and others towards that goal. By the way, platform companies pull whole ecosystems with them. So it's possible to do that. The third element here, I recognize that a manager's output is really the output of his or her organization. When they finally reach that understanding, then they're able to really delegate and structure and communicate and lead more effectively. And then this other idea of not really backing down on what you know to be most important, this delicate balance of being in charge, listening to others, but at some points really taking a stand. So the anchors for Gates was really a deep understanding of both the technology and the business. We have lots of stories, but a very deep understanding of software programming, going back to his high school days. What he could do with software code was quite remarkable. And he often is not given credit for how good a programmer he really was. But he also understood the business. He understood the idea of making software code into products and mass producing those products. And he was always focused on making those and selling them. Got into big arguments even in 1975 with hobbyists about, we want to charge money for software, not give it away. Long story behind that, but that really was his anchor. And he created a company and brought other people to that company with that same mentality, deep understanding of the technology, but also the willingness, the desire to make money from that understanding. And not everyone in software, particularly going back to 1970s, had this kind of mentality. Software was often considered an art or a hobby. Grove was really, I think he was driven by the pursuit of discipline, and with a strange mix of this intense desire to get information and data and quantify things, but also a very firm belief that that kind of analysis only took you so far. And in the final analysis, you really had to rely on your own judgment or intuition. And so this was, again, a remarkable set of almost contradictory qualities in Andy, which probably made him difficult to deal with. Is always pressing people for data and information and analysis, but then he would sit back and make a decision. Steve Jobs was sort of like that too, but he never pressed people for analysis or data in the way that Grove did, or that Bill Gates did. He was also a scientist learning to become a manager, and I would say that Gates and Jobs never paid much attention to how to learn to be a manager. And this was a difference among the three. Gates and Grove were, well, Gates and Jobs were really entrepreneurs, became CEOs, thought about managing, and over time learned a lot about managing, but Andy Grove was hired actually as employee number one at Intel in 1968. And he was charged immediately with running the company. The other founders wanted nothing to do with running the company. So as a scientist, he had to figure out how to run a company. And he read everything he could possibly find on operations management, forecasting, planning, semiconductor technology, even wrote a textbook on the physics of semiconductor technology, I think more to teach himself what semiconductor technology was all about. That book he published in 1968, I think it was. He also wrote a book in 1983 called High Output Management. You would never find Steve Jobs or Bill Gates writing such a book. And then he wrote Only the Paranoid Survive in 1967. Jobs, the anchor, I think, was really his sense of product vision and product design, and elegance and simplicity, but what makes for a unique user experience. So he was focused on the product. Gates was actually focused on the platform. And Grove was focused on the process. I think would be a simple way to describe them. And these are different ways of being a CEO and being a leader. And they were all successful. Yes?
Could you explain a little bit more about the difference between a platform and the products?
So, yes, a product is, when a company controls all the elements that the user experiences, we'll call that a product. They design, or they may purchase some components, but, and the value of the product is really contained in the product itself. But very few high-tech products are actually self-sufficient in themselves. So there's things I can do with this product. I can take pictures with it, I can run some software applications, I have a calendar, I can make telephone calls. But actually even the telephone call requires another company, requires a telephone service. So when the product really requires what we'll call complementary products and services that other companies provide, then that product is really a platform for bringing together those complementary applications and services. The other feature of a platform, as opposed to a product that just incorporates features or components that other companies make, is this idea of network effects, that the more users you have, or the more of these complementary products or services that become attracted to the platform, the more valuable that platform is. The reason Apple is worth, or has been worth, $600 billion is because its great products became great platforms. And 700,000 companies have adopted this as a platform to create their own applications and deliver their own services for all sorts of things, including my little flashlight application, which turn on right here. There it goes. And I have to read a little ad on the bottom about my travel options. So that's the key difference. Okay. And again, so if you're in this kind of a company, it does make a difference on how you manage. There's a lot of material I could show you on these guys, and we've collected a lot for the book. I don't want to take too much time with it. I want to actually have a chance to talk with you. But Gates, for example, this idea of knowing the technology and the business. I love this comment from the New Yorker in 1994. IBM thought they had Gates by the balls. He's just a hacker, they thought, a harmless nerd. What they actually had by the balls was an organism which has been bred for the accumulation of great power and maximum profit. The child of a lawyer who knew the language of contracts and who just ripped those IBM guys apart. The key idea here was Gates retained the rights to relicense the DOS operating system to other companies. He gave it to IBM for $50,000 or so, but he retained the right to relicense it, and Intel retained the same rights for the microprocessor that was in the first IBM PC. Because of that, IBM lost control of that product, which is really a platform, and all the wealth really went to Intel and Microsoft after that. But Gates knew exactly what he was doing. Intel didn't quite know what they were doing, but they figured out fairly quickly, within a few years. But Gates knew immediately. And he knew that because he had seen what had happened to IBM when a clone market had occurred in the 1960s around mainframes. And he knew there would be a clone market, and he encouraged it. He nurtured it. And that was really the great source of Microsoft's power and wealth. Andy, again, this is long, but I'm just trying to give you some idea of how he thought. And he really thought about information. This is from High Output Management. Your decision-making depends on how well you comprehend the facts and issues. This is why information gathering is so important in a manager's life. It's why I spend so much of my day doing it. Jobs, more about intuition, not really so much information, not so much analytical thinking, but intuition is a very powerful thing, more powerful than intellect. You sit and observe, you'll see how restless your mind is. If you try to calm it, it only makes it worse, but over time it does calm, and when it does, there's room to hear more subtle things. That's when your intuition starts to blossom. Your mind slows down, you see a tremendous expanse in the moment. You see so much more than you could see before. This is like a Zen experience. But this is very much the way Steve Jobs thought. And we see his thinking in the kinds of products his company designed, which are very different from the kinds of products that came out of Microsoft, for example. So again, this is the personality. And there are other people like this. And I guess the problem is when you run into other CEOs like this who are not successful, and you're trying to direct them, but yet they think that their intuition is their master, and they don't know what they don't know, perhaps. Problem with choosing 3 very successful CEOs with these kinds of attributes is we could probably find a lot of other CEOs that have similar attributes but were complete failures, right? So that's the old survivor bias problem in this kind of research. Nonetheless, aware of that, we're still trying to learn from these 3 guys and how they thought, how they behaved. They were clearly unusual. Sense of value, this is another key insight. When Microsoft was founded in 1975, he did it with Paul Allen, who was a hardware engineer and software guy too. Paul wanted to make hardware and software, like most other companies in the computer business did at that time, including IBM and even Apple. Formed the next year in 1976, made whole PCs that had hardware, software. They didn't really make applications, but they tried. Gates said, no, we're only going to make software. And his reasoning was quite clear. And expressed here in a later interview. I thought we should do only software when you have the microprocessor doubling in power every 2 years, which had been going on since roughly the late 1960s. This was a statement by the co-founder of Intel, a guy named Gordon Moore, and he introduced this idea called Moore's Law in a 1965 paper, that if we invested properly in the industry, microprocessor power would double every 2 years, and the price would probably fall by half or more. And we've seen that over time. So they were aware of it. And by the way, the first Apple II PC in 1976 used one of those little Intel microprocessors, the 8088, and so did the IBM PC. Anyway, when you have a microprocessor doubling in power every 2 years, in a sense you can think of computer power as almost free. So you ask, why be in the business of making something that's almost free? What's a scarce resource? What is it that limits being able to get value out of that infinite computing power? It's software. Not everybody had this insight, by the way, in 1975. What were you doing in 1975? I was actually learning how to fool around with learning how to program and write things on a mainframe at that time. Sense of value also. As Jobs explained when eliminating an older technology in the Macintosh, quoting hockey star Wayne Gretzky, skate where the puck's going, not where it's been. Grove, again, a manager's output is the output of his organization and the neighboring organizations under his influence. Again, teams, know what's most important. The engineers came up with 38 reasons why it couldn't be done. I said, no, we're doing this. And they said, well, why? And I said, because I'm the CEO, and I think it can be done. And so they kind of begrudgingly did it. But then it was a big hit, Steve Jobs. Many of these kinds of examples. Gates has them, too. And now Gates and Jobs, again, had this deep understanding either of the technology or how they wanted to package the technology. Grove was a scientist, more technology training than either of those 2 guys. He had a PhD from Berkeley. But he really was more focused on the whole management process because that's what he was thrown into. So you wouldn't find Andy taking these kinds of stands because he didn't have confidence in his own judgment. He relied on his brain trust. I have some great examples of that too. Attention to detail, and obviously you can see if we go through all these in a structured way, it's going to take a fair amount of time. So I'll try to go through some of these quickly. But this was really useful for me because I'm writing this chapter and trying to structure it. Identify a few clear objectives, know when to rely on data versus intuition, identify critical leverage points, and teach others why the smallest details matter. This is, again, this unique ability to pay extraordinary attention to even the smallest details, like the color of a button on an icon, which is the kind of thing that Jobs would do. But why are those important, right? And they would always relate them to the big picture. For Apple, it was to have the best user experience they could possibly create for people. Or for Gates, it was, again, to make sure the software worked in the way he wanted it to. Or for Grove, it was to actually make sure they could turn this complex process of manufacturing semiconductors into something more of a predictable, scalable engineering science. Grove, the objectives, if we focus on everything, we focus on nothing. Well-chosen objectives are part of clear message about what we say yes to and what we say no to. Intuition versus data, also from Grove. You have to know when to argue with data. This other point, when dealing with emerging trends, you may very well have to go against rational extrapolation of data and rely instead on anecdotal observations and your instincts. Some things, some major changes, it's not clear from the data what they mean, right? And there you do have to make some guesses about the future. And again, that's part of strategy, and it's part of their paranoia. Did they know the internet was important in 1994 or 95, for example? When do you say we have to switch? Gates made the determination in 1995. He wrote his memo, "The internet is a tidal wave that will envelop us all," in 1995. He had not paid any attention before that time, really. Many other companies were too late. Intel went through a number of these kinds of changes. The leverage points, comment Gates made to me doing interviews for Microsoft Secrets in 95. The products that comprise 80% of our revenues I choose to understand very, very deeply. And when Bill Gates says very, very deeply and looks you in the eye, he means very, very deeply, down to the smallest element of the code. Small details. Jobs stayed involved from beginning to end to make sure everything matched his vision. He'd check off on the smallest things. That's how you get discipline. Inside Apple, a new book. The brain trust. Give power to people with the knowledge. A very important insight from Andy Grove. Makes distinctions between organizational power and knowledge power. And very much Intel was built around that idea. We also see it in Apple. We also see it in Microsoft. Learning to let go, recruiting smart people with skill sets that complement your weaknesses. How many CEOs actually recognize their weaknesses and will recruit people deliberately to offset those? We see that happening with these guys. Grove's comment, for our inception, we at Intel worked very hard to break down the walls between those who possess knowledge power and those who possess organization power. The salesperson knows his territory, the architect, the engineer, possess knowledge power. The people that marshal resources, set budgets, etc., they have organizational power. One is not better than the other in managing strategic change. This is an example of how Andy didn't understand the difference between RISC and CISC processors, which was a tremendous battle in the semiconductor industry, and is actually going on today. All these devices are running on RISC processors, reduced instruction set computing. Intel is more complicated, requires more power. That's why you don't see Intel in these devices. And that's a tremendous shift because by far the most popular devices for computing and communications today are these kinds of smartphones. These sell in the hundreds of billions now and have actually, tablets have actually surpassed PC sales now. So this is a whole market that after Grove left, his successors have sort of missed. But the debates were there in the 90s. And Andy Grove admitted he didn't understand them, but he relied on his CTO. And he says that although the encounter with the CTO did not lead me to a firm position, it helped me form a framework in which to better evaluate everyone else's arguments. Intel decided to incorporate the reduced instruction set architecture into its designs gradually, incrementally over time. So they have caught up, but they lost a lot of market. Gates, in letting control, at my level, what do I really control? He used to review every line of code that was shipped from the company. He learned that he couldn't do that, and he learned to trust other people. Working with A-plus players, they like to work with other A-plus players. It's sort of another kind of network effect that goes on at the organizational level. And this was very much the way Jobs worked. It's very much the way Gates worked, and also Andy Grove. Finally, and we're almost at the end, structure the unstructured, these key values that they had. For Gates, it really was the platform-centric growth, prominence to the platform. They would not build software that was not compatible with DOS or Windows, and Windows with DOS. And that put tremendous constraints on what the company would do strategically. It also was a tremendous source of an engine of wealth for the company for decades, but it had its consequences. But the key thing that Gates and his brain trust were able to do was to do what I call scale up the hacker approach. They figured out how to structure software development in a flexible way that was important for this very fast-moving and unpredictable industry. And they did it in a very different way from the way Apple did it. Apple is actually not a particularly good software company in terms of structure. What they come out with is great, but how they do it, even they don't understand. And they've gone 10 years between really true updates of some of their operating system releases, and actually never succeeded in doing a good update to the original Macintosh software. They had to buy the technology to do it. But they are great. They've turned out to be a tremendously creative company. Microsoft is much more structured, much more machine-like in ways that sort of fit what Gates wanted to do at the market. Grove and Intel is really about strategic planning and resource allocation, but in a peculiar way, with some direction from the top, a lot of authority pushed down to the bottom and middle management, and actually strategic direction ultimately being led by middle managers who best understood the market and the technology. Sort of made the company somewhat incremental in what they would do and how they would manage change. Whereas Apple was much more radical because they lost most of the markets they were in, so just burning all your bridges to the past, which in my terminology is breaking compatibility with your platform. They did it 3 times. Microsoft never did it, for example. Intel never did it. Well, they did it once, but in a very minor market. And for Jobs and Apple, the creative thinking about products, strategy, and marketing, the whole culture of Apple around the user interface, the attempt really to codify how Steve thinks, if you can do such a thing. And that's really what Apple has been trying to do since 2008, since Jobs knew he wouldn't be long for this world. And that's really what they've been trying to structure, this creative process that made them so successful. Whether they'll succeed in doing it, we don't know. We're trying to find out more about how they're doing it. But so Gates on the hacker process sort of skipped that, but it's scaling up small teams, and there's very specific ways they learn to do that. Grove, the idea that strategy is really determined by resource allocation. Who has the authority to spend money? We have a long discussion of this, but Intel's decision to become a microprocessor company, not a commodity memory company, was really made by the middle managers who were allocating factory capacity. That's where they saw the market moving. So the generals on the top of the hill, Andy Grove and his buddies, they didn't actually realize. They thought they were a memory company when actually 80% of their factory capacity had already been allocated to the microprocessor business because the PCs were exploding in demand. So they sort of followed middle managers, and then they restructured their strategy and their resource allocation and their R&D commitments, which had all been toward memory. And that all happened in the early 1980s, early mid-1980s. So that's an example. So that's where this, again, he learned from this experience. I'm convinced that corporate strategy is formulated by a series of such actions, like allocating resources, far more than through conventional top-down strategic planning. In my experience, the latter always turns into a sterile statement, rarely gaining traction in the real work of the corporation. Strategic actions, on the other hand, always have impact. So we talk a lot about this idea of where does strategy really come from and how is it executed, and what is the role of formal planning versus other ways of making decisions. Another comment I really liked from Andy. And by the way, we are weakest on Steve Jobs, and so we're actually going out to California in a couple weeks, and we'll spend a week doing interviews, and so we will enhance a lot of the book with more research we can do. But Jobs is no longer with us, so we're talking with people who worked with him, to the extent they will talk with us. The other problem of Apple is they have a very strong culture of secrecy, so we're up against a lot of these brick walls. But Andy, again, preparing for the unknown, or the unforeseen disruptive event that wipes out your business, like Amazon to bookstores, for example, or Expedia to travel agents, or the internet to conventional software companies. If you run a business, you must recognize that no amount of formal planning can anticipate such changes. Does that mean you shouldn't plan? Not at all. You need to plan the way a fire department plans. It cannot anticipate where the next fire will be, so it has to shape an energetic and efficient team that is capable of responding to the unanticipated as well as to any ordinary event. Okay. Again, part of his paranoia. Companies have a little bit more control over what they do than a fire department, but in many cases they are fighting fires, and that is part of, again, what CEOs have to live with. And then Apple University is this other point I will talk about, again, trying to structure the way Jobs thought, how to unleash innovation, sustain that at Apple, and Jobs focus especially on accountability, attention to detail, perfectionism, simplicity, but also secrecy. So Jobs created this thing called Apple University. He hired 3 very prominent professors, including the dean of Yale, stolen away from Yale in 2008, a guy named Joel Podolny. One's a sociologist, another one stolen from Harvard Business School. Richard Tedlow is a business historian. And the other guy is sort of a strategy guru, Morton Hansen from Berkeley. So they're the leaders of Apple University, trying to learn, codify, and teach others to think like Steve Jobs thought, if you think that's possible. Okay. So the conclusions, we haven't really finished the concluding chapter yet, but we're trying to focus on skills that we can pull out from understanding these 3 guys and that other CEOs can learn, again, about strategy, but also about being an organizational leader, being able to execute. And our hope is that the next generation of CEOs and companies, from the big guys, Amazon, Facebook, Google, those folks, down to the startups, will be interested in what we can learn from those 3 guys. So that's it. And I'd love to get some feedback and questions and hear what you think. Okay, right here.
I'm just curious if you analogously looked at folks like Larry Ellison, Michael Dell. I mean, there are other CEOs that have been incredibly successful in the same spaces.
So we'll talk about them in the
They have
conclusion.
some of the same attributes.
Definitely, they had some of the same attributes. So we haven't really done that kind of systematic analysis, but we think these features are pretty common to these very successful CEOs. But they are in different contexts. Like Ellison actually fits this profile pretty well all the way through. From outsized ambitions to trying to create a platform rather than just products. Michael Dell never succeeded at creating any kind of a platform. He's really just a complementer to other people's platforms. In other words, he builds products that rely on Intel and Microsoft technology and other technologies, and that's been a weakness of the company. So that was never something he was able to do. He understood it, but he took a different role in that ecosystem. But we know and have worked, talked with, written cases, taught about Michael Dell and also Oracle. Well, we will talk about those, but I guess the idea of this book is to take the 3 guys that David and I know very well, that one of us knows really well and has written a lot about over the past 25 years. But we do think these are common attributes, at least of high-tech executives, or at least elements that are important for success in these kinds of businesses. There's another hand that went up over here. Yeah.
But thank you. It's delightful. And I'm curious, the anchors that you're talking about seem so personally oriented. And then when you talk about structuring the unstructured, it seems like you're actually talking about creating within the organization the kind of personality that can't live after the founder disappears or dies. Is that intentional, and could you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Well, so the anchors are personal, but it was, and I thought about this for a while, that these 3 companies have very specific personalities and cultures, which are extensions of these 3 guys, but they actually have been institutionalized in many very specific ways, formal ways, and also informal ways. And I think they realized that that is important, that they couldn't, Gates cannot read every line of code, cannot build every product, cannot test everything that goes out the door, cannot make sure everything is compatible with Windows, right? But he can set rules and a process for building things that others can follow, and which is what they did. And they created that process. They want to be creative, which is sort of the hacker model, do things quickly and not get hung up in the sort of the bureaucracy of the way the big iron guys like IBM would build software. That was a really distinctive element that Microsoft had and gave them tremendous advantage. But that had to be structured in a way that other people could carry it on. So we had to do that. And was not only important for delegation while they were CEOs, it was also important for surviving, for the company to survive after they're gone. No one lives forever. So it's not really a contradiction. I think it's just hard to do. And in Microsoft's case and Intel's case, what the CEOs did, I think, was more amenable to structuring. In Apple's case with Jobs, their design process had this unpredictable creative element to it with a lot of very strong personalities involved, actually, that we don't learn about because Apple did not want to publicize them. The only one that's really gotten any great publicity is Johnny Ive, the head of design, British guy. Very strong personalities, and Jobs could keep them together. He could mobilize them, motivate them, and the results were just path-breaking and breathtaking, right? We never saw these kinds of products from any other company, even though some of them failed as platforms, because the best platform wins in a platform market, not the best product. That's another thing I learned and have written about. But structuring that and figuring out how to make that into a process. So Apple has tried to codify some of those things. And we read a little bit about what we know, how they have meetings, how they build prototypes, how they debate different ideas. And so again, it's important for CEOs to recognize that they can't be in control of everything. They need to at least allow people around them. That's where the brain trust comes in and structure comes in, to try to codify, institutionalize the key things that made them and their company initially successful with them, right, around their anchor. Okay. Hard to do. Yeah, Donna.
I was asked to be a part of the Microsoft Vision team when they were coming out with unified communications.
Okay.
My job was to see how technology impacts people.
Mm-hmm.
It was a really fascinating job. And to go back to another hat I wear, when I work with the military, one thing they always say is, what is your center of gravity? What do you have to protect at all costs? I had to keep that in the back of my mind when I was working with Microsoft, because the technology was so extraordinary. You could get carried away with the integration of all the technology so that you're always accessible. But what did that mean to the quality of life for the people who were using it? That was the center of gravity I had, behind, in the back of my mind on a regular basis, and had to challenge them.
Mm-hmm.
They were so good at doing what they did, and to integrate the technology so you could be on a beach and accept calls and to determine who you would accept calls, faxes, whatever, emails from, and be directed so nobody ever knew where you were, but it meant that you were always accessible. What did that mean to people and the pressures that were continuing to mount on leaders' lives? The second piece of that, when they came into my office to wire me up with the most state-of-the-art video conferencing equipment, what they did was they wanted to make sure that I could call in no matter where I was to work with the team. And then they set this up in my office. A client called from the field. It was security and intelligence world. They did not have an off button. So this poor young techie who came to wire my office watched as I literally pulled all the wires out of my system and said, leave, and threw them out of my office. And I said, my center of gravity is to absolutely protect my clients at all costs, and you're not giving me the opportunity to do that. There was no off switch. I was to be constantly on call. So to look at success and how that could powerfully and negatively impact the lives of the people who are using these platforms, etc. I think there has to be, from my perspective in the coaching world, a systemic world, that balance and that center of gravity. Are
Yeah,
you
well,
addressing that in your book?
We're providing different perspectives, but that's completely consistent with what I know about Microsoft, and they would put the sort of the technology and the platform objectives first, and some of the technical objectives first.
Yeah.
And usually with Microsoft, you've got to wait till they get that, go through the feedback loop, usually 3 times, and then they sort of have it better. Never perfect. Whereas Apple would take a different perspective. He might put you, the user, jobs first. He has that ability, or he had that ability to put himself in your shoes first, whereas Gates would look at it as an engineer.
Mhm.
And the connectivity, the platform, the integration was first and foremost. So again, that's the personality of these companies, for better or worse. And for the technology people and corporations who placed integration and connectivity above personal ease of use and elegance and simplicity, they won those markets. And actually, most people went in that direction for various reasons, mostly because of the kinds of applications that were built around the Microsoft and Intel technology. But they did learn from Apple. The reason that Microsoft products are in any way usable today, I think we can thank Steve Jobs. He forced Microsoft to do it. And for 20 years, Microsoft's entire R&D initiatives around Windows were really set by Apple, just to copy the best features of Apple and do some things that they weren't doing. So actually, if you want to step back, probably the next generation CEOs should try to take some of the best features of these 3 larger-than-life personalities and companies and maybe try to combine some of the best features, avoid some of their weak spots. Microsoft has plenty of weak spots, by the way. And so does Intel, and so does Apple.
Have you spoken to Steve Wozniak?
No. That's interesting. No, we haven't. So
He has some really good stories about jobs.
I'm sure he does, and we've read a lot from Steve, and Steve is, and we write a little bit about Steve. Steve has been sort of out of the loop since the Apple II, but that's not a bad idea, actually. He might talk to us. But sort of get into the back, yeah. With the kind of Hawaiian shirt. It's a paisley. I think it's paisley. Paisley.
I was fascinated with your observation about paying extraordinary attention to detail and the big picture. And that's clearly something that the 3 of them have in common. An anecdote that I have from a similar time period is being at Commodore Amiga, where we were developing software and hardware that was years ahead of what anybody else was going to do. And we would bring leadership into the locked doors of engineering and show them what we've been working on. And they would miss completely that they'd just seen something that nobody had done or was going to do anytime soon, and then comment on the color of the prototype's case.
Right.
So it seems like it's both something that's true of the very best of CEOs, that they will pay attention to the finest detail and the big picture. It's also true of the worst of CEOs, that they focus on a lot of details. And there are a lot of good CEOs in between who learn not to pay so much attention.
Yeah, so I highlighted that principle. That's one of the, I guess it's we argue, should we call them sub-principles or precepts or themes? We don't have a good terminology yet for these, but I highlighted that because that's what I was struck by from what I know or my interactions with these 3 guys and reading things they did and knowing people that work with them. I think it's an incredibly difficult balance, and I think the tendency is for most CEOs and senior executives to get overwhelmed by the details, particularly in these very complicated businesses where you're juggling. See, the platform business, you're juggling half a dozen balls at the same time. Plus, you're on the bleeding edge of the technology in many cases as well, and things change very quickly. Your knowledge becomes outdated very quickly. Actually, Bill Gates' knowledge is already outdated about the products the company's building. Andy Grove realized that. So how can you teach that? is one of the things that we struggle with. We think you can. When you talk to Gates, though, and probably Jobs too, I never had the chance to talk to Jobs about this, but I did have a conversation with Gates about this kind of thing. He thought intelligence was largely innate. Education was important, but people that could cut through the clutter and really quickly understand what's important was and what was not was a sign of intelligence to him, or smartness. And I don't think he really believed you could teach that. You just had to find it. And so he believed that. And so he, from early days in the company, developed a recruiting process that consisted of logic questions, technical questions, and through a very intense interviewing process, usually that lasted a couple of days before they would agree to hire you. And they're trying to find those really smart people who also had the kind of values he wanted. He also wanted people that could work in a team, who would not just be these lone wolves, shut themselves off. Go dark was the Microsoft term. Just go in a room, shut the door, and you never see them again until they come up with something brilliant, perhaps. He didn't really want those kind of people. Whereas Jobs was that kind of person. He liked those kinds of people and found a way to integrate them into his teams. But, you know, I don't know. This is a question for you. Can you teach that kind of thinking? Our belief in a business school, and I think law schools work the same way, is that through multiple cases you can build up an individual's experience vicariously, but you can teach some of this. You can show them examples. But when the new situation occurs, will someone be able to make the call and understand what is really important here? That it's not, you know, we hope they can. And we hope through these examples it will help develop your sensitivity.
I think you touched on one of the key points, which is explaining why that particular detail matters, and being able to prioritize one detail over the
So I introduced the word teaching here, and it struck me that I actually thought that these guys taught. They didn't use the word teaching, but I look at Andy Grove, I believe he was teaching people. He was learning at the same time he was teaching, but I believe Gates taught other people and Jobs taught other people. And they may have, their lecture might have been in the form of standing on top of a table and shouting, I want this because the user will see it and it's important and it's consistent or not consistent, and that's what we're trying to achieve. The user will notice it. Someone will notice it if we don't do this. And if you start slipping on one thing, the whole edifice collapses, and it's the basis of discipline. So I think they taught, and so CEOs have to be teachers in some way as well as leaders. Right. Okay.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was very interesting, but I'm still struggling with the concept of the organizational anchor. The reason why it's probably triggering off a whole lot of thoughts on my side that go into the organizational development psychology side. But how would I explain in simple terms what an organizational anchor is to somebody who is CEO and comes from the business side? I don't get the grasp on it. I don't get it in simple terms.
Okay. Well, I've just invented it, so. And it's also something I can see and feel more than describe in simple terms. But I'm going to definitely try to describe it in simple terms. And perhaps in the writing it will get simpler as we go through more drafts. I just completed a draft last night. Although the idea of this came to me probably 6 months ago. I don't know how to describe it, but I feel that these three guys sort of put a stake in the ground and said, I am really about this, and I'm going to build a company around me that has these similar values and knowledge base, and strategy and structure are going to flow from that. And it was very different for all three guys. Again, and I'm limited to what I know about these three guys. But for Gates, it was, I think when he looked around the world, he saw software code. And he created a company around that. But he also, in some ways, saw saw business. He wanted to create a new profession of the software programmer and selling software products, and that was his base. He created a company, actually probably the first software products company. There were a couple others that that seemed to create and sell products, but he really was the first. And it was very distinctive, and it was very different from any other company that had been created at that time. It was a company and people he attracted to the company and strategy set, and they also, I talk about this in the book, they also figured out how to organize a company that was focused around creating software products. Again, no one had done it before, and there were different functional roles and processes that they introduced. And it all flowed, I think, from his understanding of the craft of programming and how it could become a business if it were structured in the right way. And again, for Grove and Jobs, they had also other stakes in the ground around which they built their companies. So it may be hard to describe, but I think, well, let's say in the case of Andy Grove, his stake in the ground was that I am not an expert on semiconductor technology. I'm a scientist, but I know how to learn. I do. I know how to learn, I know how to analyze data, I know how to think, I know the limitations of data and analysis, and I'm going to use those principles to create a company that will be at the state of the art in this new technology, but we'll structure it. And actually, Intel became known for repeatability and predictability. They build every factory exactly like every other factory, for example, and that's the way they figured out how to master one thing, and then they replicated that process and structure exactly a dozen times, 20 times. And that's that kind of thinking, which is not about creativity, it's not about getting to the lowest level technology, it's just finding out what works and figuring out how to repeat that and planning around that. So that's his personality, and Jobs was very different. So I think there is such a thing. It's interesting that, I don't know what others feel, but I think, I think it'd be interesting to hear other ideas on this, because it's a new concept, no one else has written about it, but I have this, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm really trained as a historian of business and some engineering in there as well. I'm also a professor of engineering at MIT.
Steve Jobs, I actually worked at Apple for quite a period of time with human resources, and one thing that was interesting is they said we are paying at the 80th percentile. So they actually paid and got the cream of the crop. So they actually put their money where their mouth was.
Sounds like MIT and Harvard.
In the 90s. So that's really what they were focused on to get their people. They actually, many organizations said they wanted the best people, but they did not pay at that rate.
Right. No, again, Harvard and MIT are the same way. They don't feel they have to. If people want to come work for us just because of the salary, that we probably don't want them. Right.
I'm confused though. Aren't you saying that Apple paid at the top, and you're saying that
He's saying
people
no.
are...
Well, they're not paying at the 100% level.
No.
They
At the
pay.
80th, but most organizations tend to pay about the 50th percentile.
Oh, okay. 50th? Okay, that's because of the median. But they're not paying at the very top.
No.
They're not trying to...
They're going above where everybody else was.
Okay, so it depends on I'm using her data to make another point. She's using her data to make a different point.
Who pays at the top? I don't know. I think very...
Nobody. No,
Very
someone is
few.
at the top.
You make it to the top if you succeed on totally variable pay rate.
Well, business schools, the business schools that pay at the top are those that are very good institutions and wealthy institutions, but they're in places people don't want to go.
Okay, that's true too.
Like Singapore.
Goodbye.
Some other comments? I don't know. Okay.
I just wanted to ask today, particularly I live in an emerging developing country, which is South Africa. And there are a few others here who also live in emerging countries. And I was really interested in what you were talking about, because you said state of the art, but you never mentioned the words creativity and innovation. And these people were working in not just an emergent field, but in the field of the unknown, almost. and were extraordinary individuals. And I was just wondering, in your book, I think developing entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs will be, well, entrepreneurs themselves will be really interested in the principles that you're talking about. And I just wonder if you're talking at all in your book to creativity and innovation, and how that might help, because for the emerging world, the way forward is entrepreneurism. That's really the only way that those countries are really going to develop and survive. So that was one question, is kind of what is in the book for them, because it sounds like there will be a lot, particularly around creativity and innovation. And then the other question I had was, did these three individuals accept being coached or want to be coached?
Well, and I do write about that issue. So first, all three were entrepreneurs, essentially, although Grove was never a co-founder of Intel. He was employee number 3. But he was there at the founding. He was also there in the early days of our earlier company, Fairchild. So we think almost everything that they did has value for entrepreneurs and developing companies that are growing. So I've done other things that are more specifically geared towards thinking through strategy at the initial stage of a company. And particularly the ideas about looking forward and reasoning backward, having some vision that's really an objective, not a pie-in-the-sky vision, but sort of Bill Gates and Paul Allen saw a PC kit in a magazine and said, in 1975, and said, someday every house is going to, every desk is going to have one of these devices on it, and we want to control the software, at least the basic software that makes them work. That's an objective, right? It's a vision of the future, a computer on every desktop. Or Jobs saying, you know, someday everybody's going to have one of these kind of devices, and smartphones and PDAs and media players are all going to converge into one device. That's kind of a vision that he had. It's not a, but you know, entrepreneurs have those kinds of visions. And we see more entrepreneurial creativity, more in things like internet services and social media, and more so than in the hardware space, where maybe because of the power of network effects, it's difficult to create new platforms, particularly from small emerging markets. But anyway, there's a lot, I think, that speaks to entrepreneurs. And we are going to write about some of the entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial companies in China, for example, and also Japan, just to try to stimulate interest from those folks, because I give a lot of talks. And 6 of my books have been published in Chinese, for example. I spent a lot of time in China. They're very deeply interested. Now, I haven't been to South Africa yet, but there's always next year. So as far as being coachable, I'd say absolutely they were coachable, and but again, it was a complicated evolution, and we don't want to go through all the details of this. But I first chronicled what happened at Microsoft in a book I did in 1995 called Microsoft Secrets, and it was a little bit like pulling teeth as the company grew for Gates to let go. But when he did, and when he was convinced by mentors, I think, actually, that he felt that were giving him advice. So the first break, well, he hired Steve Ballmer, who was his college roommate in 1980, to come back to Microsoft. Ballmer was doing an MBA degree, and he needed someone who could wear a suit because he had to talk to the IBM guys. And he had a suit, and none of the other programmers had a suit, but Ballmer had a suit. So anyway, that's what he said. But actually, he needed someone with a little business experience, and that was Ballmer, who'd worked a couple years in Procter & Gamble. But the first real mentor he had within the company was a guy named John Shirley, who was an executive at Radio Shack. And he learned something about the customer and selling computers and marketing. That was 1983. He brought John Shirley in as a CEO. But he had some other people that would give him advice, and he would listen. But Gates is very discriminating as to who he listens to. Then he hired a guy from IBM, Mike Maples, in 1988. Became a very important person in the company. And then there's a few others. I think Jobs was more difficult probably to coach, but and we also know there were ferocious battles around even product versus platform. I haven't gone through that talk yet for you, but Apple was not successful even with iPod and iTunes, until they opened it up to Windows users. Because prior to 2003, you could only use an iPod and iTunes if you had a Macintosh. And Macintosh was 2% of the market. But Jobs wanted complete control over the user experience. And he couldn't do that on other devices, other platforms. So he violently resisted. And not until he agreed to open up iTunes to Windows users not until that happened did the revenues and profits and value of Apple explode. And I mark that as when they became a platform company, not just a product company. He gave up control of that, opened it up to other users. They still were slow and clumsy and too controlling, which is why today it's Google Android smartphones which dominate the market. They have about 70% of the global market right now, compared to about 15% for Apple. Microsoft is not even a player in that market, though, because they sort of were too focused on the desktop. But so he was that coach. So we actually know a little bit, and we're meeting some of the people that were in the room when that decision was made. I don't know if it's coaching with people standing on the table, pounding their fists and arguing with each other, but that's sort of what happened. But logic ultimately won out in data, and he agreed.